So I begin by acknowledging that today we are gathered on unceded land of the Banarong people. We recognize their continuing connection to the land and waters and thank them for protecting the environment since time immemorial. We pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. We stand in solidarity with First Nation people in their struggle for voice, truth, and treaty. Today, we know also that family violence is not a women's issue. It is a justice issue. It is global, systemic, political, generational. We need everyone to understand its roots, its effects, and the solutions. We need everyone, regardless of their gender, to play a part in preventing it. So today you're going to hear from a wonderful panel of amazing group of people who have been working on this issue for a long time. And they will each bring their own perspective, insights, and experience in how they're traveling on that. And what have we achieved so far? The format for today is that we've got Hala, who's going to be moderating the discussion between all the members of the panel. And she will be asking them questions, and later on we will open it to the floor and you'll have the opportunity to also ask questions and participate in the discussion. Let me begin then now by introducing the wonderful Hala Abdelnour. Some of you would know her and would have seen her in many events and conferences, and those of you who haven't met her before and haven't heard of her or known her well, you're in for a big treat today, because Hala Abdelnour, I've known her since she was 12 years of age. We both have come from Lebanon. We migrated here because of the Lebanese civil war. And I'm absolutely in awe of what Hala has achieved over the years in how she has grown into this amazing activist, campaigner, fearless woman who is not shy, who doesn't shy at all from calling it as it is. And I have actually got to learn a lot from Hala recently on her work, especially in working with male behavioral change programs and understanding how the perpetrator issues actually, I didn't understand much about perpetrators because I only work with women. But unless we understand that as well, and how the issue of perpetration of violence actually occurs, we can't really go forward on this. So please join me in welcoming Hala Abdelnour.
Thank you. I was wondering if you were going to tell my whole life story. Thank you for not doing that. I think the real stars of the show are sitting with me here, and I think one will rock up it soon, I think. I've been told, yeah, great. Welcome everyone, and on behalf of the panel, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're on and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge any First Nations people in the room with us today, and pay my respects to your elders as well. In starting conversations about social forms of violence, of which family violence is one and gender-based violence is one, in doing the acknowledgement, I like to just really think about the country we're on right now. We're sitting inside a building. It was built on sacred lands that have been taken care of for generations, tens of thousands of years, by the traditional custodians. And the lands, like anywhere, like this planet, this earth, give us so much nutrition, so much life, health, nurture, strength, and challenges as well. So I just like to think about what's underneath this building and what's around it, and what may have been once upon a time before we erected these structures here. Welcome to the panel. Instead of reading bios, I'm a bit more of a conversational style of moderator. So I will ask you each to bring yourself forward into this conversation. The way we're going to run it, there's a couple of things I've got in mind. It's the 16 Days of Activism. some of the themes around that, calling it out, what that looks like in our communities. So how do we engage our communities in conversations around family violence, thinking about activism and campaigning, bringing forward some of the work you do. And we're going to have that conversation for about half an hour or so, open it up for questions from the audience, have a bit of a break, and then we're going to come back and have another conversation. We'll continue the conversation looking more at system structures and processes which are also impactful in our work, and we might think about the National Action Plan for the next 10 years and other things that influence the work you do in this space and the communities that you're working with. And then we'll have Q&A at the end of that as well. So, to bring you into the conversation, I might start with you, Solange. Is it Solange? Thanks to my French colonial education, I can pronounce Solange.
Who knows, because I don't say my own name properly, so that's embarrassing.
So if you kick us off, and just for everybody else, just your name, your current role, and bringing yourself into the conversation, something that's unique that you bring into the work that you're doing right now. So bring us into what the work is and something unique you bring into it.
Thank you, Hala. Thank you, everyone. My name is Solange Ardilles. I am Chilean-Australian, migrated here when I was 2 years old. And I'm a consultant, so I actually do work across not-for-profits, government and business to try and bridge the gaps and get more connection between those three sectors to make sure that we are working on things such as activism in a safe manner. I wear multiple hats actually as well, and part of that is actually empowering and uplifting community groups from non-English speaking backgrounds, but also minority groups to be more involved in their civic participation. So that might be voting, it might be lobbying government, it might be lobbying services. The unique thing I bring, I guess, to the table is I actually grew up in this area. So Dandenong, home my whole life. And I think there was a lot of value in my upbringing in coming into an area like this with so much diversity. So I grew up in an area where I had friends from all over the world, and I was able to identify the challenges in moving to another country. Things like, you know, interracial relationships, things like our mothers having to go out into the workforce when back at home that wasn't really a necessity. But here with the cost of living, that was both parents working. It was things like not having your safety net of your extended family to take care of your children, having to rely on strangers to do so. And in doing that, I've gone through my career across, I've worked in law enforcement, I've worked in not-for-profits, I've worked in job services and in charity. And it's one of those things where at every single stage of my career, I've been able to plug into, to tap into my upbringing and how important it is to give people an opportunity to say what they need rather than impose what you think they need. So that is my unique, I guess, value prop for today.
Absolutely, that's great. And I love the sort of image, the visual I got then of the sort of the building blocks that we create, you know, as we pile on our experiences, personal and professional, and bring that into consideration as well. Thank you. Welcome. I'll go over to this gentleman right next to me, Nazir. We've met for the first time today, I think. Shocking to everyone because we both have worked in men's behaviour change programs. Give us a little bit more insight about what you're working, the areas you're working in at the moment, and what you bring into that.
Thanks, Hala. Hi, everyone. My name is Nazir, and I'm an Afghan man, arrived in 1999. And I have two things to say about my work. I'm working with Relationship Australia Victoria as a men's family violence practitioner. I do intake assessment, run a men's behavior change program, and Afghan dads group also, tuning into kids, and doing some case management as well in Relationship Australia. But today I'm here to discuss some more things about my primary prevention project that we, state government, they have funded our community organization Victorian Afghan Association Network Association. And this project is for 3 years, and it is a primary prevention project. Started last year, and it will end in June 2024. So what unique things I bring? I think I can bring language, tradition, norms within my community when I'm working with the community. And my community is an emerging community. It's very new community. Family violence and all those terms or issues, it's very new for them. Back home, there is no services, or there is no concept of family violence versus family violence is. And but the unique way I work with them is I sit with their issues, because it is very even when they have a lot of issues, they are under a lot of pressure, and it is I see with the lens of intersectional lens their issues. I sit with their issues and unpack their issues when I'm talking to them and when I'm engaging with them, and discuss their beliefs and try to find out what their beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors they have, or some other surrounding issues surrounding them, for example, work, unemployment, and those issues. So I'll sit with them, discuss these things, then I'll bring the issues that what human rights are, what women's needs are, what women's rights are, and children's rights are. So this is the way I work with them.
That's fantastic, and would love to unpack that a bit further with you throughout the conversation about those strategies we use. Thank you. Anu. Anu and I go way back spiritually.
Yes, we do. We're probably sisters from different mothers in different parts of the world. Hi, everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here. And people will be surprised I'm meeting Hala for the first time after feeling like I've known her forever. So my name is Anu Krishnan. As it says over there, I set up a consulting company called Cultural, which I think marries my different experiences. I'm from India, originally from India. I am what I'd like to call myself as a general all-purpose family violence expert. Sounds like a terrible word, but someone who knows more about family violence, then definitely I need to. But my background is in social anthropology and social work from India. And my first job, fresh out of MSW, was working with police in Delhi. Now, if people have read and heard things about Delhi, you'd know that family violence goes back a long way. And in the late 80s and early 90s, it was a terrible place for a young social worker to be. But what it did do in a very, very diverse community like Delhi is that it gave me an insight into how violence can look from an angle of different communities. And since then, since the late 80s, early 90s, I've lived and worked in 6 different countries, all in family violence. And I worked in the Middle East, I worked in Asia, I worked in New Zealand, I worked here. One of the things that's given, especially coming back to Melbourne in 2012, is when I came back to Melbourne after being away for a long time. The demographics of Melbourne had changed, and what I found was that my experiences gave me a very unique perspective on how to work with different communities when you're talking about family violence. And the 2 separate areas that I felt I was able to bring my expertise in is how to talk to communities on what they can do when they see violence come up within small ethnic groups. And it becomes very personal. One person being violent in one part of the community seems to reflect on everybody else. And as a migrant, you're hypersensitive to how people perceive you. And from the angle of the person experiencing violence, the victim survivor and the perpetrator, you don't have the social capital that someone who's lived and grown up in a community does. So you don't have the networks of support which can help you come out,
and in fact which can empower you to make a disclosure and seek help as well. So I feel like I can bring that magic ingredient to conversations. And now in my work, I do a lot of training development for services on how they can work with these communities. I do a lot of work with community organizations in informing them on how they can look at violence as a long-term issue, that they can help prevent violence in 2050 by making sure they're doing the right things now. So that's a little bit about what I do. On the other side, I do run men's behavior change program in a few different languages because, like Nazir, I'm privileged enough to be able to speak a few languages. So I run MBCP in different languages, and that's been a very enriching experience as well. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you, Hala.
Thank you. And another element you've brought in, which I think is central to this conversation, is context. The social environmental context around any community or individual or family. Where are you and what's going on in that context and at what point in time? Certainly something that we'll come back to. Now, are there other panel members that would like to join us on stage? And yes, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I probably got a speeding fine coming here, but I can't be late. But I could have.
I feel like time is a racist concept as well.
It
really
so
is.
It so is. And yes, I was thinking about like this hybrid world we live in now, where some people might be joining us online, and it's so much easier to be on time online, and the fluidity, you know, and sort of the difference of energy when you're in physical space with. So welcome, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We won't.
Apologies, thank you for waiting. But I also do, just on the concept of time, I feel like it's also quite cultural as well. Like, anyway, not to make excuses, but I do struggle.
But this is part of you bringing yourself into the conversation, Deanna. So Deanna and I have met a couple of times too over various spaces. And what we've done is bring everybody into the conversation. So your name is Deanna Sayed. A little bit about what you're working on or through or with at the moment, and what unique value you bring into that, or what unique quality.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me this morning as well. Thanks, Hala. I really appreciate it. Good morning. As mentioned, my name is Deanna. I am the current CEO of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. If people have heard of our organisation or not, we've been around, hi Dalal, we've been around for over 32 years, and we started very humbly by a group of Muslim women who realised that there needed to be very specialised and tailored services for Muslim women because of the unique experiences that they have in a context of so-called Australia when they arrive here from countries, particularly from crisis and conflict countries, and then they come here and they have a unique journey of resettlement and integration and sort of the layered approach that Islamophobia, you know, back then I don't think we even had the language around it, or anti-racism, and then being women as well, and navigating the sort of structural and systemic issues of that journey in Australia and not having the right supports, and as you mentioned, that social capital, not having those extended community networks, and then language, and we talk about language, even just understanding their experiences and being able to put words to it. I think that also has a really big impact on women being able to access support services. So we started very humbly as a refuge for Muslim women experiencing family violence to be able to go and seek safety, and we know housing is a huge issue and it continues to be, and a lot of women often will return to those who perpetrate violence because the current system is just not suitable for them. And so that's how we started, and 32 years later we now have expanded into doing a lot more work, programs, casework. We do a lot of work with newly arrived communities, but it's always underpinned by research and evidence-based data collection, because as we know, there's just no data for Muslim women, and I actually don't use the term cold I don't use it. I don't think it's appropriate. I think it's really quite reductive, and it reduces us to an acronym, and we're so much more than that. And Muslim women specifically are so much more than that. And so this reductive frame really just doesn't acknowledge our agency and how much we can drive our own lives when the structural and systemic barriers are removed. And that self-determination model is what we abide by. And so we're a human rights organisation, and so we represent the plethora and the multifaceted way that Muslim women identify. It's so cultural, it's not through a religious lens, it's layered, it's complex, it's multi-ethnic, and it's family, and so we don't really judge on any of that. So it's a very, very much a human rights approach. So yeah, I've been CEO for 3 years, and I joined just before COVID, and so it's just been crisis after crisis. So yeah.
Can you imagine what a time?
I know, what a time to be alive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And thank you for bringing in even more topics for us and things for us to consider in this conversation around identity, belonging, and how systems will impact us, which we'll come to in greater detail in the second half of this conversation. And a part of me was thinking, as you were speaking, oh, where is Batul? And Batul is has had to fly to Turkey for a family emergency. But let us have a conversation with who's on stage now. Okay, of the things that have been brought up, I think, start to shape a little bit about the world you're all working in and what you're facing. And I'm thinking about the different lived experiences just in existence, pure existence, of Australians. If we think of the Australian population, some of us have ancestry that dates back tens of thousands of years, which was significantly disrupted 250 years ago. And we're navigating family violence and these, conversation we're having today within that context. Some of us have 5-6 generations back. We have systems around us that reflect us quite a lot. And we're dealing with challenges, life's challenges in various ways. And others are dealing with life's challenges as well as having just arrived or arrived a couple of decades ago or a couple of generations back, and all the things that come with that. So when we think about my day-to-day life and what I have to think about, and then what we're doing is having that as the base layer underneath a conversation about the experience and use of family violence and how we navigate that. So that was great contexting by the panel. And let's start with one of the themes that's actually an ongoing theme. And I find this really interesting. The wording hasn't changed from calling it out. And we hear a lot of people talk more about calling it in. So let's bring both of them in. But calling it out is a bit of an ongoing sort of theme of 16 Days of Activism. And it's around raising awareness about what gender-based violence is, what family violence is, how it impacts women and girls and children. So I'm curious. English is the international language, so the campaign and all of its themes are in English. How does it translate in the communities you work with? And does it? And if so, how do you work around calling it out or calling it in? What does that look like where in the spaces you are in? Who would like to take that first? Thank you.
I'll go first with that just because I was very lucky to be on a few different advisory groups for COVID recovery. Now, I don't want to assume that everyone knows this, but obviously with COVID, a lot of family-based violence was exacerbated by multiple stresses there, loss of jobs, little access to food or support services, etc., etc. I could go on. But it was just really interesting to see how, like the whole world, everyone had to just get to it and start to respond, and how that failed to really, how a lot of service providers and I guess even decision makers failed to really capture the nuance, the need between different cultural groups, and how they were going to be able to call out if there was family violence or raise it as a problem. It was also a lot of I heard a lot of assumptions, I guess, of, oh, you know, if someone experiences family violence, they'll go to the police. And I have an adoration for the police because I used to work with them, but I also understand that a lot of cultural groups and people, individuals, will actually avoid going to bodies like that. And they will rely on, you know, cultural leaders, religious leaders to go and raise these topics. And it's actually dangerous to generalise how to address these topics. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Thinking about calling it out, and I think we can certainly further explore reporting. That's one element you can take on this conversation. Then the other element is to think about the idea of bystander action as well. So either of those.
I think just coming back to calling it out, I think one of the challenges that many communities have is language. And when I say language, I literally mean the words on how you would tell someone that, hey, I'm experiencing family violence, or if someone sees that there is family violence going on, what words could you use which are culturally and linguistically appropriate to actually tell someone that I think what you're experiencing is family violence, because sometimes you're not sure how that would be received. And very often in communities, everyone else knows what's going on, but the victim survivor is probably not even aware that what they're experiencing is family violence. And you can't unhear or unsee it once it's told, but after that, what next? What support are you going to provide? And how long can you stay there holding someone's hand? And I keep coming back to the concept of social capital. Like, most organizations give you 200 something hours of casework. Is that enough to help somebody come out and be okay, be independent with the repercussions of calling it out? And that's a challenge that many people in the community face. Like, they might know what's going on, but they're like, don't want to do that because I might just disturb everything and leave it a bigger mess than before it was reported. And we see women, particularly from multicultural communities, go back into violent situations, and all you've done is made it less likely that they're going to ask for help the next time around. And who knows whether you've empowered the perpetrator to say, yep, she's tried that once, she's not going to do that again. So have you increased the risk for a victim survivor by going in all guns blazing? That's a terrible analogy, sorry. But that's actually quite terrible, saying that sounded terrible. But yeah, I mean, so you really need to be able to give people language, and I think that is probably the role of people like ourselves who work with community, who can give people language to approach and discuss these issues with a lot more safety and with a lot more warm blanket effect, I think is I'm going to call it. And I can say that.
Always. I've got so many things to say all the time. So I just want to also say that in my fluster, I didn't do an acknowledgement either. So I'd like to also acknowledge that I think we're on the wrong country, and to acknowledge all the elders past and present, because I'm a settler on stolen lands. I just want to start also by just going a bit back. Like, sometimes on these 16 days of activism, and because I have a history as a human rights lawyer and working in campaigns globally, overseas, and here in so-called Australia, sometimes these campaigns and their slogans like call out bystander action. Like, what does that even mean for our communities? Like, I just find that those frames, and even like English as a universal language, I'm sorry, I find that so offensive. English is not a universal language. Like, it could be, sure, but if you actually map out the world globally, pre-colonisation, and even now, the English is not a universal language. And so
it's international.
Oh, international, okay. I was like, what? No. So I just...
Thank you for not knocking me over the head with your microphone.
I just know, but I think it's actually like part of the structural issues or the way that the United Nations or others create these campaigns. And I feel like when you try to talk about these ideas in a family violence context, calling it out, bystander action, it's quite punitive. Again, it's taking an approach to something that is like deeply part of, it could be part of the patriarchy, it's part of the systemic systems of oppression, it's part of how we've been conditioned and socialised, and calling it out or having a bystander, you know, intervene, that's actually not a changer and driver of attitudinal shift and change long term, because it creates a sort of an atmosphere of shame and further stigmatises the victim survivor. And so we do need to call it in, we do need to address sort of those very sort of endemic root causes of this conditioning that we have and try to disrupt it, rather than have these big campaigns and slogans, which I don't think actually has resonance. If I go out to a community and talk to a Muslim woman who's fled her family violence, and she's from Somalia or Afghanistan, and I talk to her about 16 Days of Activism and what she's doing, it doesn't translate, right? So language, yes, is important, but it has to have that cultural context, but also the sensitivities that come with it as well. And so when we understand around family violence and even talking about it, and I know at the moment the buzzword is coercive control, right? So when we think about how we want to criminalise it and take a carceral approach and that punitive approach and policing, I'm sorry, but you know, we live in a colony where violence perpetuates and is a continuum of violence, and that's not helping anyone. So we really need to just be really mindful, really conscious, and question those very normative ways that we just want to stamp something out by criminalising it and taking a carceral approach, because the police, no offence, and I'm seeing uniformed police officers in the room, but they're not going to save us. And I think we really need to think that through very carefully. And even just when we talk about coercive control or economic abuse or spiritual abuse, all those ideas, in our communities, some of that is actually, you know, part of our cultural or our ideas, and that's accepted. And that also needs to be talked through really sensitively. You know, like for example, and I don't want people to take away something stereotypical or whatever, but like for example, economic abuse. In a society where we actually, the male is, has the financial, like it's a decision that is made by the couple that the man will be the financial minder. If an external comes in and is like, well, why aren't you making the financial decisions or the mortgage payments? Oh, that's economic abuse. Okay, we've got to report that. It doesn't always translate, that's all I'm saying. It doesn't always translate in every context, is what I just wanted to say. I know that didn't come out right somehow.
No, it came out great, because that's how complicated I think it is. And language is an important factor. And, you know, it was deliberate that I said that English is the international language, because the campaign is in English. And the majority of people in the world don't speak English as a first language. And so when we say the theme, this is a orange the world. It's the United Nations. You know, so I know in Lebanon, orange is a political colour, and if you don't like that political party, you definitely don't want to orange the world. So, you know, these decisions that are made at a global level are made within an institution that actually has 6 official languages, of which I speak 4, but English dominates still. And thank you, because that's the context. So I keep going, context is my word for today. That's the context we're in. We're working with communities in a context where we are on Aboriginal land, but we have an Anglo-centric system that dominates the discourse, and then we have so much diversity within our communities. And I'm going to actually jump to a question, because it is, I feel it's coming in now. We have such diverse communities we work with, and I would like to hear from as many of you that can speak to this as possible. The communities we work with didn't all arrive to Australia at the exact same time and didn't come from the same parts of their countries. And if it's a massive cultural group, they might have come from multiple countries but have the same ethnic identity, or they might have different ethnic identities although they come from the same nation state. They also might have different faith affiliations or not, right? So when we say, oh, I work with the Afghani community, I work with you know, the Arabic community or Lebanese or South Asian, like just to group people, Middle Eastern, diverse, so called, and we don't like that. We don't like that term. We're actually talking about groups that arrived in Australia at different times, are experiencing different things right now because of when they came, are attached. So we know there's a cultural freeze that happens when we arrive, and we stay connected to a cultural model of back home that existed when we left. And so even if someone's the same ethnic, religious group as me or whatever it is, they're not the same because they came yesterday and I came 30 years ago. How do you weave that? How do you incorporate that as you engage communities in these conversations? Let's hear from you, Nazir. Yes.
Thanks, Hala. Yeah, maybe I speak on the context of Afghan community. So Afghan community, some of them, they arrived like 30 or 40 years ago. I myself 20 years, and in last year when the situation of Afghanistan unfortunately unfolded badly, and some 4,000 or 5,000 people, they arrived in Australia. So how we incorporate that, what we have done is in Afghan community that we, when we established that organization, we have that unique name. It is very controversial name, Victorian Afghan Association. There is a lot of division among Afghans on the name of Afghan because of the long-term oppression and persecution, whatever. And there is a lot of division among Afghans, like we are different tribes, different ethnicities and different faiths. So there is a lot of division among them. But what we have done is we chose that name to the people because they are familiar with that name and this name can attract them. And we are working for the last few years. And when the new arrival start arriving last year, and this community organization by that name, and a lot of the new arrivals, they start coming to us. They start coming to our doors, and we are providing them service as well. Even that community organization, most of them, the members, they belong to, majority of them belong to Hazara community, and we are the majority in Victoria in Australia. But the smaller group also, they are looking at us, they are coming to our doors. That's what we need to do, and we bring the people in under one umbrella and work with them, and especially around family violence. When I was talking to Anu before, there is a lot of disclosure with the new arrivals of family violence when the community service organization, they are working with them and the settlement services, and there is a lot of disclosure. They are saying that family violence happening, and even with the new arrival. So it is something that we can incorporate that and work with them and provide service or awareness about the family violence.
Did you want to say something?
So much. I'm so glad you asked the question because my first arrival in Australia was 98 or 99. My first job was with CP. And at that time, probably I was one of 2 or 3 people of color in the organization. And I come from India, I look very Indian, so I automatically became the Indian expert. And if there was a client who was remotely Indian looking, I'd be like, ask Anu. And I don't even speak the same language as that person. I'm not from the same part of the world. My experiences are different, relatable, but different. And from that, we have come to understand that there is a lot of internal and external diversity within migrant communities. Now, just taking India, not even South Asia or the subcontinent, 1.3 billion people, 27 official languages, multiple religions. But more than that, the economic diversity of migrants largely influences how they interact with services. A young international student who comes from third tier or fourth tier small town is far less empowered than a person who's come on a work visa, is working for one of the big multinationals, probably comes on an expat contract. To put them in the same box and expect them to have similar experiences is delusional. But that's what we see. The other thing that, particularly in relation to family violence, is how a person interacts with services here is also dependent on how informed they are about their rights, which again is a function of many of their life experiences, and two, how they perceive authority. A lot of communities have a natural mistrust of authorities, and I would say that large parts of India would probably be that. They really fear people in authority. Most migrant communities would be terrified of child protection. I mean, you say child protection and so many people just shut up, and that's used as a tool of coercion by violent partners. One of the ways in which I find communicating with diverse experiences and communities from my own background is that I use the language of fear. So for me to explain what violence is if something makes you afraid, you have to start questioning why and then work backwards from there. And I find that that resonates a lot better than labeling a particular action, as Diana said. Like if someone makes economic decisions, someone comes from the outside and says that's economic violence. It's not. I mean, you have to work with, does that decision making instill fear? Are you not able to talk about it because you're afraid? And that, I think, cuts through a lot. I work a lot with men, and apologies to the men in the room, but I do find that simplifying it to the easiest thing to relate to is often the best way of conveying. So one of the things, and I don't know if there are many people of South Asian background, one of the things that many of us would have grown up hearing is, on a weekend, don't make any sound, your dad is sleeping. I can see a few yes, yeah. So I always ask the men, just think about why your wife or your mother or your sister, your aunt says that. Does she want to tell the children that if you get woken up in between your Saturday nap, the outcome for you would be really bad, that you might be abused, you might hit your children? Or is she saying it because dad's had a really tough week and therefore just let him sleep? So just putting that in context, it's almost like an aha moment for the men. And I ask the same question of the women, why do you say it? Are you using the male in the house as a way to threaten and therefore perhaps softly exert power? Or you're genuinely conveying concern? And that conversation, I think, needs to be highly nuanced, and which is where I think cultural knowledge comes in handy. Yeah. I don't know why I spoke about that.
That was a great example, and that's sort of the kind of things we want to draw out a little bit more. How do you connect with what works with the communities that you work with in terms of bringing them into the conversation? And we'll if we can hear from others about examples of that, what's working to engage men in the conversation, to engage women in the conversation, and then we'll open it up to audience questions.
I think that, first of all, just thank you for sharing that, Anu, because I think, unfortunately, a lot of what I hear sometimes, it doesn't break through to all people. I think that there is, that mistrust goes at multiple levels. And I did want to make mention of just how important a first impression is. And I know that there's many service providers here, some that I absolutely admire, like Wellsprings, and there's many others out there, but it's just, I don't want to take away from where we're going with 16 Days of Activism and everything's about, we're talking about gendered violence, but I want to go punch to a sidestep in terms of the racial part to it, the racism that's experienced by people from when they go to a service provider. And it's not, racism is such a touchy topic, but it is just that whole, we can't ignore that, again, there's racism within cultural groups as well. And so, I've heard people say before, I don't want to go to that service provider because she's from my community or he's from my community, and they might, you know, say something, they might share something inappropriately externally, they won't understand, they'll send me back, you know. So I just wanted to add that, like, I like how you've explained that in terms of like simplifying it down to fear, but it's because it's also important to not go in and label it yourself as the practitioner, but empower the person to educate them. Maybe not empower, I don't like that word too much, but educate them to identify why maybe they should question their safety, their environment, you know, the dynamic of their relationship, whether that's financial, social, etc. I don't know if that added much, but I just wanted to give you kudos for that, yeah.
Any other examples of?
I just wanted to piggyback off that. I think we've just got to be really, again, like always come back to language and how we talk about our own communities, because I think that's important and it frames how external people outside the community speak about us, and we have to actually drive that conversation. And so when we talk about empowering our communities, we don't need to be empowered, we've got inherent power. We don't need capacity building, we've got capacity. A lot of it is structural and systemic to actually curtail our power, to limit our capacities. And so we've just got to push back on some of that. And I think also when we talk about different experiences and the plurality that exists within communities, and that's why I rebuke a lot of these like very broad brushed ways that they describe us. And I think even when it conflates migrant and refugees, right? Very different, very different. Like you cannot, it's like a false equivalence. You cannot actually bundle those two together, because a migrant has the dignity and the agency to choose to resettle in Australia. And they come here on work visas with partners, and that's a choice. And they come here, and yes, they then will maybe struggle with some of those racism, the institutionalized power dynamics, the trust deficit with authority, for sure. But that journey actually informs a lot of that resettlement journey. And someone who comes from a country of crisis and conflict, who may have travelled in a precarious situation through a third country, who have had a protracted conflict where they've been in a refugee camp in a third or fourth country, they've been forcibly displaced multiple times, they've not seen family, they've had no social capital, they might have been trafficked, they might have had sexual exploitation, and that trauma is so layered that when they arrive here in so-called Australia, they may have been in mandatory offshore detention as well. No language, no abilities, no understanding of the systems, and then they come here and the system's like, okay, so migrant and refugees. I'm sorry, no, that is not the same. So I also think that's really important in how we talk about people's resettlement journeys here in Australia, and the social capital and the plurality and the trauma, and it's layered. And yes, we take an intersectional approach to that for sure, and we need to have a trauma-informed approach. But I think the communities inherently understand that nuance, and so we can drive it and identify it. And I do think that it plays out in translators, not having the right understanding of family violence, policing, child protection. And so when we talk about child protection and that fear, I think it actually is so layered that this conversation, we talk for hours on it, but I just really urge people to question some of those ideas and frames and language. Language plays out in other ways, yeah? It's not just someone's ability to translate their language into English. It's how you talk about those things, you know? And it just doesn't always compute that way. So you can have translation, but is there, you can communicate, but is there comprehension? Communication and then the understanding as well on the other side is really important.
I did also want to just mention the importance and the role of like the media in terms of what stories make it to the front page, which ones don't, and then the importance of like now that representation in the media, and that there's a big push to get more colour in the media, because if you can't see someone talking about something that's important to you that you can relate to, it's really easy to just say, oh no, they won't trust me, they won't believe me, and it separates out a lot of people. So I've really quite enjoyed the shift now to get more colour in the media, because even with topics like this, you know, people are dying from family violence like at a record number. I'm not very good at the statistics, I'll leave it to the experts, but it's something that I've always noticed that it is dependent on the racial background of that person to whether the story actually makes it to news and stays on the news for long enough for it to get to sessions like this. So I did also want to just make mention of that and why it's important to educate all of our different groups of people, men and women, children as well. I'm very pro educating at a primary school level as well, because it's about respect, and unfortunately that is kind of still a miss in the media, and hopefully that'll shift, and that's what these kinds of activism, you know, events are really supposed to be doing, but there's a long way to go.
I think they're great points, and I think COVID taught us a lot of things, and one was maybe where we lack strengths systemically in passing on information, in educating communities and in reaching out. We saw that, and we can only just assume that the same is happening across other areas in life that we want to provide more education on. You know, thank you for raising the point about the difference between migrants and refugees as well. That's something that's certainly come up with in conversations I've had in training practitioners and asking them that question, do you know what the difference is between a migrant and refugee? And as someone who came to Australia as a migrant but from a war zone, my sister and I have had this conversation many times, and we should have been refugees, but we weren't, and that was actually a benefit to us. It was an advantage. But we kind of were refugees, but we weren't. So it's a really interesting experience. I think that I'm getting looks from the front row, so I think it's time to ask the audience if you have any questions for us. Well, ask you if you want to ask us something before we go to a break.
I'm curious about language, wanting to be respectful, and you're talking about the difference of labelling somebody as a migrant or a refugee so you can understand something of their journey. And Diana, you were saying you don't like the term called. So I'm just wondering what you do find to be, or any of you, a respectful term to use, or is it just about the individual person's own journey?
Thank you, and it's Diana. So I think that's a really good question, and often you actually just answered it. I ask people how they identify themselves, and I think on Nazir's point as well, you know, like even working within the Afghan community, asking them, you know, do you identify as Afghan, or would you rather be Hazara or whatever it is that you want? And that goes for LGBTQI communities, it goes for a plethora of all communities, is that we just really defer to them as the experts on their own lives and to just inform us, really. And that, again, that shift there really creates that dynamic that we're not talking down to people, we're actually really wanting to respect that and their journeys and how they identify, and also where they're at in their journeys and meeting them where they're at. And I think that mutual respect and dignity is afforded, and then you actually find that you will build a much stronger relationship of trust and rapport there. And that, again, identifies people's agency, and you are respecting the plurality and the diversity that exists within communities. And so just having that question, that's, you know, we have to just assume. And I have actually brought this up at the highest tiers of government around the terminology. And they're really conscious of it and cognizant, and it was a sort of an accidental acronym that came out of like a statistic through the ABS did the surveys and the census. It was never meant to be something that became mainstream cult. It wasn't meant to be that term. So we can actually discard it and start taking back and reframing how we want to be identified, because it actually has an othering. It's quite othering as well. And when we talk about mainstream versus multicultural communities, we are part of the mainstream. Why other us? Why create this notion that we are not the mainstream? Like, I find that's quite problematic too. And so we've gotten to a point in our journey, it's 2022, like, let's not use it anymore. And so when we're really conscious of how it plays out and how it has that impact of othering, then we can just like take a stance, right? So I just will not use it. I won't let anyone in my organisation use it. We don't talk about it. And that is inherently our power move. And it's a flex and I just do it.
Any other comments on that one?
I might just add something. I was very fortunate a few weeks ago with Hala. We met Auntie Joy Murphy. She's one of the elders from our lands here, and it was just interesting her take on how people really tiptoe around just being direct and asking how someone likes to be identified. You know, identity is so important, and Auntie Joy Murphy just said to me, she's like, I understand that people want to be respectful, they don't want to say the wrong thing, but just ask, just come and ask, have a conversation with me and get to know me. And I think that can be relatable to everyone from LGBTQI communities and from different cultural backgrounds. I only myself was educated a few days ago around a campaign that asked the census to, it was a campaign to get Hazaras to actually nominate as Hazara instead of Afghan. Now, I really wanted to dig deep into that, and I was like, why is it so important, etc., etc. And it was because being labelled as Afghan to some people, it groups them with their oppressors. And I thought that was really interesting, and I think that's why it's so important. And thank you for putting your take onto this answer. It's important to just have confidence in yourself, take the fear away. We're all people, we're all part of the same group here. We're in a lucky country like this. Let's just have honest conversations and get to know one another.
Thank you. I think this is a great conversation, and it's far bigger, because it is actually a systemic, and we are going to move into talking more about systems. So I feel like we have been talking about systems already, which is great. So we're just sort of going to weave everything in together. But it's really important to understand where those acronyms come from, how broadly they're used, what countries they're used in, who do they describe? Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Who do they describe? And who's doing the describing? And I guess the impacts of that, we can unpack that a bit further, and within the context of how do we bring people into the conversations. So let's have a 10-minute break. 10 minutes? Yes? 10-minute break, and refreshments are out there somewhere. Yeah? And we will resume in 10 minutes. We'll come back and keep this going. Thank you, everyone. Okay, welcome back. I know some of us really enjoyed the very special ginger beer. I don't know what the other flavour was, but they were pretty cool little bottles. Thank you for providing those. They're very exciting. I hope there's more at lunch. I personally, I'm enjoying a cup of tea right now, and I hope some of you did as well. We will resume the conversation. And kind of looking a little bit now for stories, if you like, examples you can give of something you've used, a strategy or a communication style or a cultural knowledge or ad hoc sort of winging it, organic flow in conversation with a community member that worked well, where you're able to engage that person, have a conversation about whether they were experiencing or using family violence, and a little bit about the outcome of that. What was their response that allowed you to see that that they took something on board from that? Would you like to go first, Nazir?
Maybe me. There is one man when I was working within Church Anu, and this guy, he was using violence against the family. He was on bridging visas at that time. And I was the case manager. I was not a facilitator. Ali was facilitator with Sakina. And this guy, because we were working with him, and especially individually when I was case managing with him, and he used terrible violence against his wife and also child. Even at one incident, he has given some alcohol to his young child. And working with him, because he was in Hazara, I was speaking Hazaragi language, and as I was said before, that technique that I was sitting with his issues, that what issues he has. And what I found about him is when I was speaking with him for a few months, and I find that the way he brought up, the way he grew up, his father was a violent man, and he was telling his story about the way he grew up, and his father was using violence against him and his other siblings, and I was keep supporting him and talking about the attitudes and behaviors that he was holding, or he was carrying, the things he got from his father. And finally he realized that he has these issues from his father, and he realized that this is not right to use violence against his wife and child. Then he was one of the guy, he became alive with the facilitators, with Ali and Sakina in the group, and he was reflecting, and he was opposing other men, and he was challenging other men in the group, saying that this is not right, that you are using violence against them. It was only for 15 sessions. Change is a very long process to change, but this man, and it was amazing that he quickly got the message, and he realized that the way he grew up was a very violent, that when his father was using violence against him. So he was the one who was challenging, reflecting, and he was very good. He was sharing and participating in the group session, and he kind of changed, and even he was not drinking after that. He said, "No, I'm not drinking anymore. This is triggering me," and he was very good at that time.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. Anu?
There's a few things that come to mind, but I'm just going to reflect a little bit on the work that I do with communities in prevention. And one of the common refrains that we get is, in a lot of multicultural communities, they equate violence with anger. So they think you become violent only when you get angry. And if we dig deeper, in many cases, it is because they perceive disrespect, particularly in highly patriarchal societies, males in positions of power within family or community structures. If they feel disrespected, they get angry, and that anger comes out as violence. That's the understanding that they generally have. So one of the things that I have done in my work is try and explore what they see as disrespect. And in many cases, they'll be like, oh, all of our women, they come to Australia and they become westernized. So they are equating the concept of becoming westernized as somehow being contrary to culture. But if you dig deeper into what their culture is, and you ask them, like, okay, what values do you really hold? What are your cultural values that you feel that the women and the children in your family or community are not following? And they'd be like, trust is a value, love is a value, respect is a value, safety is a value. But what in your attitude is reflecting safety? And if you're shouting at your children, if you're telling your wife she cannot wear a Western outfit when she goes out, how is that conveying to her that you are worried about her safety, or the fact that you love her, or the fact that you care for your children? Over time, it does like have that aha moment with them. And I find that just making those simple connections with people within the community is enough to create awareness. And while I completely agree with Nazir that, you know, if you have 15 weeks or a 20-week men's behavior change program, Nazir and I have done the 15-week motivation for change program in language for quite a few years. I do the 20-week men's behavior change program. A lot of the community workshops are 3, 4, 8 sessions. It's not enough to completely change attitude, but you just latch on to a couple of these things to just open their eyes and create awareness on, if this is the cultural value that you hold really dear, then how are you demonstrating that to others in your sphere of influence? And if you feel that calling out somebody's disrespect in this kind of manner, in a violent manner, how are you actually showing respect? And leave them with that thought, because good as we are, I don't think we can change people in 1 minute. We won't be here, we'll be doing something else. But yeah, it gets the conversation started, I think, within communities.
Fantastic. I'll turn to my left.
Yeah, so I think, you know, we work across different issues that present uniquely in the Muslim community, and we all know that our men don't have a higher propensity to violence. That's also something that we need to push back on, that narrative or stereotype of Muslim men being inherently aggressive, or, you know, whatever other stereotypes people have. And yeah, I think Nazir talking about how trauma plays out in the home as well is really important to identify that. But the way that we need specialised services to respond to our communities is because of the way that it does present. It doesn't present higher or less, it just presents uniquely. So, for example, within the Muslim community, we work on the issue of early and forced marriage. And the context that the federal and state government has identified at the federal level, it used to sit in the human trafficking and modern slavery framework, and then within Victoria it sits within the family violence context. So navigating the two sort of systems, because in terms of sometimes families will go overseas to marry off, and it's a very gendered issue. So young women will be taken back to their country of origin, their home countries, and married off, sometimes unbeknownst to them that that's something that their family is planning. So we need to have the mandate within the Department of Home Affairs to work with Border Force and other sort of international, sort of bringing them back to Australia. So the example around effective sort of working in communities is that this is an issue that we've been working on long term, and we were actually very adamant that it not be criminalised. Again, taking a very carceral, punitive approach to our communities means that it will be driven underground more. People won't report it. People won't talk about it. There will be more shame, more stigma. We actually are putting our communities at higher risk of this happening. So what we have done is that often this approach to communities is at a very crisis intervention. Let's report it to the AFP. Let's put the Border Force at notice and stop them at the airport and not let them travel overseas if we know that there's going to be a forced marriage happening in their country of origin. That's not the approach we take. We take it very much about, it's not just an individual. You've got to involve the families. You've got to involve the elders. You've got to involve religious leaders. You've got to involve community leaders. You've got to actually take a very prevention, early intervention approach from schools, engaging with schools in taking a trauma-informed approach, working with social workers, with the teachers in the schools, and actually talking through some of the drivers of early and forced marriage. What does that mean for communities? What is it that's driving that decision where their 15-year-old daughter may be acting up in school, or she's not going to school, or they're worried that she might be LGBTQI, or what is it that the parents, again, coming back to that fear, what is it And once you unpack those layers, it actually does come down to identity, culture, norms. You know, they are actually worried that their child might be losing their sense of culture or identity and bringing shame to the family, having a boyfriend, experimenting, which actually is quite normal at that age. So when we talk to the young women and they express that their parents don't understand them, they don't understand who they are, there's also a generational gap, there's a language gap, even within generations that newly arrived communities. The young girls are exploring their identity, they're trying to navigate being hybrids, right? Being Australian, hyphen something. Australian hyphen Lebanese, Australian hyphen Afghan, whatever it is. So, it's about shifting those attitudes as well, longer term, and getting the young girls to understand, talking to the mothers, talking to the community elders. And so we take a whole different approach rather than focusing on those perpetuating violence, because at the heart of this, if you're going to criminalise forced marriage and prosecute the parents for their daughter being married under 18, what are you actually achieving by that? Prosecuting the parents for their children getting married under 18. Like, how is that actually addressing the root cause of this? And so we often talk through it, we talk through those drivers, we try and address it, identify it early, and then we see that shift in attitudes in the community. They understand the law, and so when they understand that they can't actually sign a consent anymore to have their 16-year-old married, then they understand that, okay, that is a deterrent, absolutely, but if they don't understand the law, then it actually becomes counterintuitive as well. So early intervention, prevention programs, taking a whole of community approach is much better, and we've seen some really great outcomes of it. We've had funding expanded. We'd love to scale it up, but we're in schools all around Victoria. We often get called in, and this is before it gets reported to police or child protection or to Border Force or to the AFP. We're in there early, talking to these young girls, talking to the parents, talking to them, and actually trying to understand what it is actually that they're struggling with and why a marriage is the only recourse, when actually it's not always that at face value.
Sorry, I've got a question.
Can we wait for Q&A time? Is that okay?
I just sort of following on straight from that. Yeah,
but it will still be relevant. We'll take questions shortly.
All right, I don't have too much to add, but I guess I did start by introducing myself, saying that I grew up in an incredibly multicultural area with a multicultural school. I witnessed before these wonderful systems came into place, when I had friends getting ripped apart from their partners because they weren't of the same cultural background. I'm sure there were systems in place to protect them. We didn't know about them at the age of 15, 16. And it was interesting to see how that dynamic unfolded, where it took my parents that had a more balanced, I guess, parenting style to jump in and protect friends that were at the mercy of their parents being violent, and then also, like you said, getting taken back to their home countries to do something that they didn't really agree with. And I rather than add another example, I just wanted to jump off how important these frameworks are now, and all of this work in being inclusive of all of the systems, the family unit, the extended family unit, the shame that comes with someone that broke away and didn't marry into their religion or their cultural group, because it really is quite traumatic and it's really dangerous. And we've seen retaliation, we've seen family violence related deaths for daughters that have broken away and their father or another family member has got involved. So I guess for me, I think I love being in this space and hearing these examples, because I'm talking 20 years ago, I don't feel like they were spoken about enough, and it was happening very often, especially in these multicultural, cities like Melbourne, maybe Sydney as well. This was happening really often, and it was across different age groups and different cultural groups. And because the cultural groups were still very much separated from each other, it was actually a bigger problem, but everyone was still working in little factions to try and solve it. So it's really great to see that it's actually happening more at a political level as well, with greater systems in place.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a great point. So much of it's great to notice how much we've moved forward in, particularly since 2014, really, and particularly led by the state of Victoria for all of Australia. And we see now a far more united national action plan to address family violence for the whole country.
I just had a follow-up point to what Solange and Diana have said so eloquently, but particularly coming to what you said, Diana, about the stereotyping of a cultural identity. So much so that many people of culture, especially the smaller ethnic groups, almost feel like their culture is viewed very negatively by mainstream media, mainstream community, and definitely mainstream services. We like the visual aspects of culture. We like talking about eating great Burmese food or Indian food, celebrating in Fed Square for different festivals. But these expressions of culture come from deep cultural values. And when families react in perhaps not so great ways when they feel that their culture is being threatened, rather than being understanding and exploring where it's coming from, being punitive, completely agree, could not agree more, that punishing families and communities for what are actually outlier actions. I mean, if every single person of a different color or culture was taking their children away to get married, tickets anyway would be thousands and thousands of dollars. These are very few outliers who do things like this, but these are what get blown up, and then the entire community is perceived with a very, very, I'm sorry, I've lost your word there, but very, very badly. So
I think that's a great point, and certainly what came up, and very aligned with what the 16 Days of Activism is about, which is primarily around gender-based violence. And gender-based violence exists everywhere, in every culture, because misogyny and patriarchy is a part of every culture. But how it's delivered or executed or acted out, that's where cultural nuances come into play. So we can look at a certain community where we see something happen more frequently than in another community, and we say, well, that's part of your culture. But we don't say that behavior. We say violence is a part of your culture. And that's where we start to racialize gender-based violence and family violence, a topic that's very close to my heart, as some of you know. And that's problematic, because when we think about how we systemically address family violence, and we want to be inclusive in Australia, we want to be inclusive of all communities, and we want to have immigration policies and border control processes that can respond to certain things without racializing the act, because the act is happening because of misogyny and patriarchy, and that's how it's getting acted out in that community. And in another community, it's getting acted out in another way. And on that, that's it. No, I'm curious to hear from you. I'm wondering about the time. Let me check the time. Okay, final question. I dream all the time about the most ideal way, and I do a lot of men's behaviour change work, and so that's where I dream about in terms of what it would look like in my ideal world, how long it would run for. I've heard a little bit of comments around the length of time that we have to engagement. I think about the various cultures I've been exposed to, but the two that I've grown up with, which are Lebanese and Anglo-Australian sort of dominating, but having exposure to others, what can I draw on what we can learn from First Nations people, and knowing what's happening in Aboriginal community coordinated organisations around addressing family violence. So I try to pull these things together and think what would be the best approach to truly end family violence in a generation, which is our ambition now in the next National Action Plan. So just as a final sort of comment before we go to questions from the audience, something from you about, we'll just go this way, I guess. What's your dream? What would work? What's missing from the piece at the moment that would make it better, that would help you to do your work better?
Wish list.
Yeah, the wish list, yeah.
I think two things. I know you said one thing, but I think two things. One is we need a more family-centric approach. And I think we need to enable people to come in much earlier without the fear of a punitive response. We need to respect a woman's agency to stay within a relationship. So many services do not engage with women if they're not willing to exit. I think we need to have a family-centered approach. We need to respect a woman's agency to stay within the family, because these are not men who the women hate. These are men that the women love. They've had children with them. They've built lives with them. And for others to come and pass judgment on, oh, if you're choosing to stay, then you're okay with the violence. And services do that as well in so many different ways. We need to empower, I don't like the word, but seems to fit here, enable women to improve their relationships. We need the violence to stop. We need the men to switch on. And yes, that takes time. I believe there are battery intervention programs overseas which run for 18 months. I would love to see that here. So we are able to work with men over a longer period of time so they can actually see the impact and the positive impacts of their behavior change. 15 or 20 weeks is not enough.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thanks, Anu. Thanks, Hala. I think, in my community, the challenges that I'm facing, especially when I'm running the primary prevention program, there is nothing, no resources, no capacity. The workforce capacity, there is nothing. There are some people, individuals who are working different services, but we don't have workforce capacity to come forward and do this job and try to prevent violence in the community. I think the system, they can, even my language, it is only a spoken language. It's not written. So how we have to create that resources for them? We have to find some creative way to convey our message to when we are working, especially in prevention program, then convey our message to these thousands of people who doesn't have any written language. So it is only spoken. For example, I speak my language at home, and we don't have this written anywhere.
Do you know of a good resource that's been created?
There is no resources, but I'm trying to find some ways. For example, creating videos. That video is a very good resources. In Touch or some other organization, they don't have any. Even they are running this motivation for change in language, but they don't have any video in Dari or in Nazariki. I created two, so they can benefit from that. But these are the things that in the system, in the government, they have to think about. And the other thing is about reoccurring trauma in Afghan communities. So what is happening with them? And when we talk about the family violence, about bystander or whatever things we are doing in the community in prevention space, they have bigger issues back home. And even they think that this is tiny, because they have friends, they have family, and they have relatives back home, and every day there is something happening, and it is impacting them badly. So in terms of the trauma, as Diana was saying before, we have to do something about that as well.
Absolutely, you can't really do therapy about one issue unless you deal with the trauma that's embedded. You can't do therapy with someone who's in a state of trauma.
Yeah, even if you are trying to organize something and suddenly something happened in Afghanistan, and the whole community, they distract from that. For example, if you are organizing some events in the community, a concert or whatever events you are trying to organize, and you have organized and you have announced the date and everything, suddenly the people, they get killed in there in mass killing, for example. whatever, on the 30th of September, when the school attacks happened and 54 girls
And the
got
community
killed.
gets,
The community, they said, okay, forget about the events, forget about the concert, or forget about that.
That's a really big issue. That's a huge, like, I guess something that we just have to know that's there, and we have to deal with that with some communities, and it changes. Sometimes it's one particular ethnic group, sometimes it's another. But thank you for bringing that to light. I'm just thinking about the time, so we might bring it over to.
Sure, and I think when we talk about reimagining a better, brighter future, I think it does take creativity, and I come from a long line of creatives. So my vision, if we're talking about a 10-year generational shift and disrupting this narrative, I'd love to see 10-year funding programs. Like, if you want to genuinely invest in this, then you need that structural investment. And we have sometimes had 3-month funding for a program, and I'm like, that reporting and acquittal process is not even worth the time for an organisation as small as ours. So let's see some of that funding and resourcing to back up these sort of very aspirational goals that I see in the National Action Plan, which is great to speak it into existence, but you've got to actually back it up with some substantive structural investment pieces to get that longer term attitudinal shift.
I'm taking from that you're also thinking about where that funding is distributed.
I feel like I'm already in the naughty books here, but I mean, like, I feel like some of the policing money and resourcing could be reinvested in some of that early prevention work. And, I know that it's all necessary within our structures and our systems, but taking a less punitive carceral approach. But when I did want to agree with Anu on that family-centred approach, like, our communities want to stay together. They've experienced so much trauma, and it's layered and it's complex and it's spanned generations, particularly for the Afghan community. So when they come here and they've resettled, the last thing that they want is to then separate their families and then be isolated from their community supports and whatever social capital that they've managed to build in the short time here in so-called Australia. So that also needs that investment in family counselling and therapy, mediation that is safe, that has family violence training and funding. But I also just, like, when I'm reimagining, like, genuinely thinking back to where we can see a brighter, better future, we actually need to go back to the heart of the truth-telling of how this violent colony came about, because violence begets violence. And if we're living in a settler colony, we can't expect patriarchy and racism not to play out if we are living on stolen land. So we actually have to really ground all of our work in First Nations justice, accountability and truth-telling. And we can learn so much from First Nations kinship, culture, the way that they talk through these, the mediation, the family ways, the elders, the approach that they take to addressing these systemic and structural issues. So I think that is the very lofty ideas that I have, but it's so layered. But I think that we have to be dreamers and we have to reimagine, and I think that we have to really be creative about ways and solutions forward. So yeah, thank you.
Hard to follow that. I would want to capture everyone's together, but more so with this whole idea of this funding, right? I have to be honest, when I looked at the action plan and I saw that it went for 10 years, I was like, why the hell is it 10 years? A lot of policies that come in place, they give themselves these run times that are just, in my opinion, 10 years. I mean, what's happened in the last 10 years? We've had a pandemic, we've had a huge crisis in terms of domestic and family violence. This is coming from a completely outside and non-expert opinion. I was like, 10 years is ridiculous the minute that I saw it. And yes, some of the targets are grandiose, but I think as well, it's like, make these things achievable. Like Deanna said, making sure that there's enough funding and programs that are able to extend for that time is important. Making sure that there's bipartisan support from political parties to make sure that these programs are properly supported with resources. From my work in terms of community connecting, I'm the current interim secretary for an advocacy platform that's been created for Casey, Cardinia and Dandenong. And it's more around migrant groups and refugees, but it brings into play the same thing, right? All these small organisations are fighting for this funding. And it's like, why? Why is this constantly the situation? Nazir made a great point about, the lack of diversity in language for communication programs for collateral. Like, why is it that even practitioners have to really dig deep to try and find extra resources to translate materials when that should be part of these grand and wonderful policies that are created? So I just wanted to add that.
Great, thank you. Lots to think about there. I think we've got time for one, maybe two questions, and we'll start with the one at the back. Acknowledging that.
That was me.
Is it still fresh? Is it still alive?
Can I brace myself?
Come
at me. Come at me.
We'll wait for the microphone.
I'm great.
Just so that, sorry, we'll wait for the microphone just so that you can be heard on the recording as well.
Okay, no worries.
We can hear her.
Yeah. No fear. No fear.
Okay, thank you. So Diana, just back to what you were saying before about going into schools. What are you actually doing in the schools? Are you encouraging, are you sort of letting the girls know that this isn't the right thing to happen to any young woman in terms of forced marriage overseas? Are you encouraging the girls to come forward if they get a hint that this might happen to them? So I just wanted to know more about that. And you spoke about the cultural differences between the young people and the families, but you didn't touch on that in some communities, and I'm not saying Middle Eastern, because it happens in a lot of communities, even in European communities, where the young people don't have a choice. It's like, we've chosen him, you're marrying him, not necessarily taking them overseas to do it. But you didn't speak about that this can be a cultural thing.
Yep.
So just on that, and I totally didn't agree with you suggesting that funding's taken from the police funding, because we're struggling. We are struggling. If you all knew how bad it is for our members who are working the ground level, we are so short-staffed that the public would be shocked to know that, how bad it is. So I can't see that as a way of fixing it.
For sure. Look, we are allies and we're working in the same systems of oppression that we're trying to address very real violence that happens on a day-to-day. And I'm not here to advocate the police need to be abolished in its entirety. But I'm an abolitionist, right? I'm a human rights practitioner. I've been a lawyer for years and an advocate, and it would be remiss of me not to actually say that, because it wouldn't be genuine. But in terms of the prevention work that we do in schools, absolutely. We are there because we are from the same communities, right? We understand the drivers. We don't come with that lens of Islamophobia or judgment, and we are from those communities. We've even got some of our workers who are victim survivors themselves. They can go there and they want to build that relationship of trust and rapport that women and young women can come forward if they are sensing that they could be at risk potentially, that they can report to us and come to us. And often we get called into schools for specific cases where the social workers or the school counsellors will actually call us directly, and we can go and work not just with the young women but with their families as well. And we've worked with the AFP very closely. We've worked with housing and other border protection officers and staffers and workers across the board. And we don't just work in Melbourne, we work in regional Victoria as well, Shepparton, Mildura and Geelong as well. So we definitely are there to provide that support in whatever realm, whatever those young women want to come to us up with. So that's the first question. What was the second question?
I might just sort of, if that's okay, I feel like that was
More of a statement.
I feel like that was a great sort of summary of, you gave good examples of collaboration, working with a systemic response with a personal response, representing community when you go into the schools.
And teaching them about the laws.
Yeah. And there's something there too, that they're coming in without stigma, without labels and judgment. And we know that for all victim survivors. We all know that's and it's actually someone who works with people who use family violence, equally important, that we approach people without stigma, without judgment, without labels. We talk about behavior, we talk about relationships, we talk about hardships, where are the blockages, what are the challenges, what resources do I have as a practitioner, what connections can I make, who can I collaborate with, and we all play a role in the system. Albeit it's not perfect. Do we have time? Are you okay with one more question? Okay, I'll take one more question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Fiona. I work for a local government and in Cardinia Shire, and I've heard a lot and often hearing about women and victim survivors, etc., and the emphasis always going on to what can women do, what are women doing, what are women learning, etc. And I hear about the forced marriages, etc. And my heart goes out to the young men who are also put into that place of being forced marriages. Sometimes it's not obviously young men, but there's also that element of things as well. But I'm curious to know what sorts of things that you see could be done in a systemic way that can challenge misogyny and patriarchy that is in existence in our systems. How do we challenge that together? And the other thing is around the competitive nature of funding. It's probably the most frustrating thing for not-for-profits and local government to have to always fight for something that is right. And what do you think that we might be able to do as a conglomerate of local governments and not-for-profits that can challenge that and actually change the game? If we keep doing what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always got.
Okay, let's
There's a bit in there.
couple of words, just any sort of good example you've had of challenging misogyny or patriarchy in your spaces.
I think education is a great way of challenging misogyny, and one of the issues that we have with funding, and I've done enough of these reports, like they give you 12 months worth of funding and they want to solve the entirety of family violence in the South Asian community with $100,000. It's not going to happen. But I think education and long-term education, one of the things that the systems that fund you, the organizations that you collaborate with don't realize is that many of the perpetrators are actually not going out there and celebrating their use of violence. And sometimes, like you have speed limits, like you have the speed cameras, speed indicators, maybe that's what they need. Regular reinforcement of what is right and why it's right. That, I think, done long-term and in a consistent, sustainable way is one of the tools in our toolkit to work with multicultural communities.
Yeah, I agree with Anu. I think awareness is the key to this solution. Most of the people, they are not aware when they are coming to this country, and they are working hard and they don't have much time to think about these, things. They are truck drivers, they are construction workers, they are on the, labor, they are doing labors, and they don't have much time, especially my generation. And when the people, they arrived here and they sponsored their families, they don't have much time and they have to catch up with everything, especially the men. And where's that awareness come from? That we have to, get fund, and we have to provide awareness among these people when it comes to the family violence, especially. They don't have much education and they don't have awareness, and one of the men, I can give that example, when he came to the service and was speaking with him, he said that it was the first time I heard about the child protection when they knocked my door. And I said, okay, police was police, but who are you? And said that we are child protection. So what is your job? Our job is to, look after the children. You have used violence in front of the children. So they don't have any knowledge about it. And I asked him that how long you are in Australia, and he said 8 years. In 8 years, we could not provide him education. We could not make him aware that there is system, there is a child protection, or there is other system when these kind of things or incident, for example, happen. Then there are organization or system that they intervene. So it is lack of awareness, I can say. And it's not only about the family violence, it's about the trauma, about the mental health and all those things that we have to. For example, mental health, if we talk about mental health in Afghan community, if you say mental health, they say, no, I'm not mental. Yeah, they think that we are crazy. Mental health has different stages, but they don't understand that and they are not aware of the mental health. And we have to have fun and we have to bring awareness among the community, I think.
And I think that there's been examples of parenting in the new culture programs, offshore education before people are resettled in Australia and then maybe on arrival. I'm not aware that these have been consistent over the years. They're sort of on and off funding, which was the second part of the question. And also the reinforcing of the message, because do I just put everyone in a room, teach them what Australia is all about, tell them about child protection, legal aid and all the other things they might need to know, Centrelink, and they're in a state of trauma? Or their language skills, or I haven't gotten the right translator. So even if I got all of that right, we know that with adult education, repeating the message and saying it a few times over. So before leaving wherever they are offshore, on arrival, 5 years in, 10 years in, reinforcing that message, I think that's a great point you've raised. And on that systemic, just a couple of points about effective lobbying, because you both talked quite a bit about lobbying governments. Has there been any space where you've lobbied around non-competitive tenders or sort of distribution of resources?
Yeah, I just wanted to also answer your questions quickly. In terms of addressing misogyny and patriarchy at the root of it, I think it does actually come back to some of those early intervention prevention programs, and we work in parenting with mothers, because often it starts in the home as well, and trying to break that generational cycle where the women tend to perpetuate those norms. And we talk to them about, do you ask both of your children, male and female, to help clean up? Or are you expecting your daughters to do the same things that you had as a woman growing up? And you have to be that driver and agent of change in your home, and really giving women the tools to do that. And that frame of gender equality starts there. And so we actually do those programs with young boys as well. We don't do men's behavioural change programs, but I think some of that work that, shifting, and I've talked about messaging and framing and shifting our ideas on this, I think a lot of it does come down to like the service delivery model from a systemic level, like they have to have left the perpetrator before we even work with them through casework or any support services. And I think we need to shift that. We have a service delivery model of providing support for 3 months rather than on a needs basis. That also has to shift, and we do that as well. It's an ongoing support that we provide. In terms of funding, I think that instead of being pitted against each other in the sector, which is part of the, it's not necessarily a unconscious thing. I think it's a very conscious and deliberate strategy. We actually can work together and put in consortiums and put in joint applications, and we're actually working instead of sitting around and being like, oh, well, why is the Orange Door being funded so extensively to the detriment of specialised smaller community orgs? Let's work with them because they're referring to us for co-case management. Well, why don't we put in some joint funding applications then to kind of alleviate that structural issue and be very vocal about it at a government and policy level, which is what I do. And so to your question, again, see that segue? Woo! Skills. So I think it's also like really important to actually bring it at all the levels of government in addressing some of those really, really, you know, embedded issues because they might not know that it's having that unintended consequence at a community level. We have to bring that to that awareness and some of the grant applications, some of the structural, like so onerous reporting obligations. Like, let's streamline that. Like, why does it have to be so difficult? And so, like, let's not make it this, like, you know, 12-month contract, 12-month grant. Why do I have to report every 3 months? Like, no, I'm not doing that. And so I have no issues with being direct to policy, grant funders, managers, government, cabinet ministers. I have no qualms because they don't have visibility all the times of how onerous they make these grant rounds for really small community-based organisations like ours. But yet they want us and need us. So then let's reframe who needs who in this scenario. And they need us more than we need them. And so I remind them of that quite often.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. I think there's a lot of power in being a collective and collaborating. And, you know, I know that there was this dynamic of talking about funding for police, funding not for police. The reality is that you're not mutually exclusive. You have to work together in order to actually address the problem. I actually did walk up to a representative of one of the major parties just before the state election and asked them, have you looked into the challenges that you create for small grassroots organisations in order to get the funding that you say is so readily available? And I think Deanna's way of explaining that, like these reporting metrics that they need and the resources that they expect you to be able to capture with such little funding is a problem. But one organisation lobbying and then another one coming from another angle, it doesn't do the job. It has to be a group approach in order for there to be true change. And that's kind of what I do on the side in terms of shifting that patriarchal, misogynistic approach to things. And I do it from a grassroots level. So, you know, I'm gathering people at the moment for a board for a not-for-profit. And everyone automatically goes, oh yes, we'll get this community elder, this community leader. And I'm sure I don't have to say to people here, generally that'll be an older man that actually has probably no real idea of what the teenagers want, what the females need, etc. So I think it's also about passing the opportunity to someone else and creating more diversity at all levels from the board down. I'd like to think that it's both ways, up and down, but it's not. I think that unfortunately our systems in Australia, the power is really held at the top and it's not enough. We were in some forums recently where it was, I loved the idea of that. It's not enough to have one person of colour on a board. It's not enough to have 1 or 2 females on a board. They do not represent the whole group of people that you're trying to provide a service to or address an issue with, an issue for. So I think that in terms of answering your question and answering yours, it's about working together and instead of, yes, maybe complaining or trying to fight against one another, that consortium approach is really important. But then also making sure that you are doing that from a grassroots approach, that even in community groups, even on panels that you have, even, you know, all of these different types of consultation programs that everyone loves at the moment, make sure that you've got true representation of who's out there so that you can really capture the voices and then lobby more effectively for true systemic change.
Thank you. You just sort of, I just had this visual of, you know, all of us sort of walking down the street, wherever you live, and recording who you see, the faces. And then like we can go into boardrooms and record who we see and then like, and then make one video look like the other. You know which one I mean. Thank you so much, Anu, Nazir, Diana and Solange, for your time today, MiCare and Wellsprings for inviting us along and inviting me to host the panel. It was a real pleasure. We did go a little bit over time, but that's okay. Just be a little bit fluid. If you've got questions still that you want to ask, there's refreshments afterwards. There is going to be a formal closing, but don't feel like you've missed out. There'll be time to interact. So I'll hand it over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Hala. Change is not immediate. It is something that takes time. And I think everybody would agree with me here in the audience that hearing from our panelists today has been something that has been very thought-provoking and insightful. For myself, some of the key points that I've taken away is that bystander action, or calling it out, as the 16 Days of Activism campaign likes to put it, are concepts that are riddled with complexities. And these complexities can be something as simple as language, context, and the literal definitions of, well, what exactly do we mean when we say call it out or bystander action? And I think that this just goes to show how profound impact that this has there for diverse communities there. Because if we're struggling to really unpack and understand these concepts here today, then can we just only imagine what it must mean to people on the ground from these diverse communities? So please, I'd like you to join me in a round of applause for our panelists today. Thank you so much. We do have some gifts for you.
This is why we came.
just a few moments. So we have a special gift for you.
It says Cocoa Black on the side. Dalal knows me well.
So definitely, thank you so much for our panelists. Hala, as always, fabulous facilitator. I don't think I need to say anything else. Deanna, thank you so much. Your words were so insightful, and I'm sure that you've inspired so many people in the audience today. Solange, thank you. I hope that you get lots of representatives for your board. Please note, I did put up your posters in the auditorium. Nazir, it's so lovely to hear about the work that you're doing in the Men's Behaviour Change Program. I have seen those videos. Actually, that's the first time that I actually connected with Nazir on LinkedIn. So it's really great to be able to meet him today in person. Definitely, I'd like to give him a shout out on LinkedIn there and have a look at the videos because they're very impactful. Anu, great as always to see you. I think she's the queen of intersectionality. A very renowned trainer and a seasoned academic and expert in the area. So once again, everybody, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for coming along today. As Hala mentioned, there are some light refreshments just in the meeting room next door. So, sorry. Who made them? Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you to Cultural Cuisines for making them. Thanks very much. And just a couple more thank yous to Respect Victoria and Safe and Equal for funding us in this consortium that is MiCare and Wellsprings. So, point out what Deanna said before about consortiums. Thanks Dalal, as always, and thanks to Wellsprings for working with us there in this fantastic event. Obviously Monash Halls for this particular venue, and not to forget our fabulous videographer and photographer Rod. Just to give a shout out, he will be studying community services next year. And all the other staff and volunteers that helped us put this event together today. So thank you everybody, and please join us in some refreshments in the next room.